Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. It has been a long day. We've been listening to a lot of very interesting presentations. But as you know that after 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, it will be a daunting task for us to keep awake. And especially, when that topic is a bit heavy. So I'm not sure whether my topic is heavy or not. But this is a topic which I've been attending to the last 2 years. In fact, it was actually a project that myself and the former professor from Madras University, we've been working on, and this book will be published soon as well by my university. So the whole idea is actually we were working on the concept of conflict resolution and the idea of peace, as expounded by the Indian thought and Indian philosophy. So I'm going to divide my presentation into 2 parts. One, looking at what is conflict and conflict resolution as we understand from an international relations perspective. Then to look at what are the elements in the Indian philosophical thought and Indian experience that we can share or we can try to understand, and look at what are the takeaways that has been expounded by this philosophical thought. So I will start with my first presentation. First slide. Okay, now the state of conflict. And as we know that when we talk about conflict, there's many dimensions. Okay. Whether it is between himself, I think there are some psychologists here. Kiki was mentioning about the problems, the conflict within the person who is autistic, right? It is between human beings, between man versus man, and it can be also between man versus society, man versus nature, and it also can be a step further, it can also be between other entities versus other entities, like organization versus organization, states versus states. Alright, so having said that, human nature is fundamentally conflictual. Well, this is a whole debate on to what extent conflict is manifested in human relations, and to what extent that humans are able to manage it amicably. Then if we were to look at what's happening throughout the world, this is 2016 data, 2 years back, and this is from the state of global peace. And we could see that, from the most peaceful to the least peaceful, and we are now in Bangkok. Now where is Bangkok? Bangkok is somewhere yellowish in the middle, so it is peaceful. Right. But I'm sure that some of you are from some of this region, Malaysia, Iran is somewhere there as well, and it is quite good in color. So, this is just, the data may not be very accurate because it is 2016, but this is to show that, whenever you do not manage conflict situations well, it can ignite, it can flare up into violence. Right? And as we experience in much part of Africa, and also other parts of the world, even in Thailand, southern Thailand, we have an issue as well. So this is to show that peace or managing peace is a problem, managing conflicts is a problem, and that has resulted in a lot of problems in much part of the world, including the IDPs, the internally displaced people. Right? You are in this part of the world, you may have heard of the Rohingyas. It's a big issue here in Myanmar, the Muslim minority, and the issues of internally displaced people, people without states. All these are conflict situations that need to be managed. Now, having said that, let us look at the definition of conflict as a precursor to my introduction into the Indian philosophical thought. There are many definitions when it comes to conflict, but generally the study of conflict or conflict studies expounds that it is essentially an expressed struggle between parties. It can be 2 parties or more. Okay, and the struggle must be expressed. If the struggle is latent, means you have conflict with another person and you're keeping quiet about it, that's fine. Right? But it must be manifest, it must be expressed. And this conflicts arise from incompatibility of goals. Essentially we look at the difference between interests and needs. Some say, as long as you have incompatibility of interest, that is sufficient enough to have a valid, legitimate conflict. Some would say, no, interest is not only element. You need also to consider needs as a precursor. Now these are some of the things, incompatible goals, and also competition for scarce resources, alright, interference from others in achieving a particular goal. So different dimensions or different school of thought or different perspective or disciplines may approach the conflict in slightly a different manner. If you look at from my area of international relations, conflict is essentially about conflict of interest between states, right? When states' objectives are not being achieved, or there is a contradiction between achieving a certain objective by another state. Now, there are three scholars who are involved in the study of research on conflict. The first is Burton. The Burton says, or rather he says about unsatisfied human needs. Conflict stems from unsatisfied human needs. In conflict, people represent their interests, but not their underlying needs. However, they will use power and coercion to meet those needs. Johann Galtung is probably another big name when it comes to peace studies. He talks about the idea of inequalities embedded in social structure that may lead to violence and conflict. And Koza also talks about conflict is not always that functional for the relationship within which it occurs, but conflict is necessary to maintain such a relationship. This is again, it comes to the idea of balance of power. Whenever there is a incompatibility of power, then parties, or rather people in conflict will try to see to what level they can exercise their own power, and they will come to some level of equality, some level of normalcy. And that's the whole idea of, when you talk about arms race or buying weapons, it's all about balancing power, right? Now, that is the first section. Now let us look at the second part, which is actually the crux of the paper, which is the Eastern tradition as a model of peace ideology. Now, when we talk about Eastern tradition here, essentially we look at two traditions. One is the Indic and also the Sino-civilization, Indian and Chinese civilization. And these civilizations have existed before the arrival of modern state, what we call the Westphalian state, the Treaty of Westphalia in Europe, that gave birth to the idea of modern states. Now, having said that, while wars and conquests have been part of this civilization, there have been different conflict resolution traditions that have been practiced to manage human interaction. Meaning to say that prior to the introduction of the Hobbesian state system, there have been also, the political entities that have existed for thousands of years, and therefore these political entities have also managed their relations with other states or within the state in order for them to manage conflict situation. Now let us look at the Indian tradition. I'm going to read a bit from the paper which I wrote as a, let me see where it is. Okay, conflict resolution from the Indian perspective. Alright, the quest for peace and conflict management were also widely reflected in the Hindu texts and philosophies. over the centuries. Through faith system, philosophy and ethics and moral reasoning, Indian sages and thinkers have offered the world numerous ideas and thoughts on how humans should deal with their existence, their fellow being and other species, as well as with the structure that govern their lives and their environment. Although originated from the Indian subcontinent, these thoughts and value system have permeated into other civilizations through trade and conquest. One important postulation is the management of these conflict and peace that forms an important part of human interaction. Indians inherited one of the most diverse societies and it has to deal with multifaceted issues more than other societies. As such, conflict management has emerged as an important tool for human relations and social management. Numerous religious scriptures and Indian thinkers have offered various explanations on how conflict should be managed through various levels and offered various paths for achieving peace. It should be recognized that Indian tradition offer different paths and methodologies to respect to addressing conflict and its mitigation and resolution. Now, the next slide talks about guidance. There are some of the few concepts that we need to understand how conflict resolution is conceptualized in the Indian tradition. Now, if we look at the slide, the concept of Dharma, essentially, it is a moral order, right, of the universe and a code of living that embodies the fundamental principles of law, religion, duty that governs all reality. Dharma is essentially rooted in what we call ethical relativism, right, of thinking, okay, which is to suggest that what a person should or should not do depends on the context of the situation, and thus virtues and transgression are both equally dependent on the contextual issues. Okay, in a context-based approach, truth appears to be relative. Thus, there is no choice but to be tolerant to the truth of others. Since Hinduism seems to operate on context-sensitive setting, it is often construed as hypocrisy by those who prefer context-free rules, like those found in the Abrahamic tradition. Hindu principles such as Dharma or moral order, Karma, consequences of actions, and Satyagraha, non-violence, offer the foundation for the mitigation and resolution of conflict. Dharmic traditions, originating from Dharma, support aspects of tradition, modernity, innovation, and conformity in conflict resolution. Aspects of Hindu teaching, such as emphasis on suffering, impermanence, and contingency. Second, every act that suffuses the spirituality and is meant to enable one to realize itself. Number 3, self-effacement and self-assertion. Number 4, emphasis on acceptance of different worldviews, ways of living and preferences, seeing them as part of the cosmic evolution of all the forms of life on earth. And 5, the doctrine of karma, with its emphasis on the consequences of our action, have contributed to the Hindu view of conflict resolution. Now, let's go to the next one. Now, what are the aspects of Hindu teaching? Right? I already mentioned this in my presentation just now. Okay. Now, let us look at one or two texts. Right? That the element of Satyagraha and Dharma has also been reflected here. For the sake of discussion, let me highlight the Shanti Parva, which is actually a text, a chapter from the Mahabharata. The 12 of the 18 books of the Mahabharata and of the longest among them. Alright? Set in a post-war scenario, alright? The ruler, which is Yudhishthira. Is that the right spelling, my wife? No, my wife, she knows Sanskrit better than me. Right? Start with this rule of the Pandava kingdom. Right? The Shanti Prabha recites the duty of the ruler, Dharma, and good governance as counseled by the dying Bhishma. This is the word. This is Bhishma, alright, which is the kind of arrows that we have in this body, of course, is going to die. Right? Okay. And also the other rishis. Right? This book has 3 sub-books, which is called sub-parvas, and 366 sections or chapters. Okay. Now, essentially, the parva talks about, if you can look here, alright, it recites the duty of the ruler, which is dharma, good governance, and also counsel by others. Okay. The treatise embodies, essentially these are the treaties. Okay. The Shanti Parva embodies the treatise of the duties of the king. Right, it's government, laws and rules, proper governance, the issues of rights, justice, and how it's prescribed the principle that will create peace and harmony. Okay. Right. Among other things that it speaks, it also speaks about aspects like the truth, non-violence, non-stealing, purity, restraint, right? And also the idea of proportionate justice. For example, chapter 267 suggests that the judicial staff should reflect before sentencing to mete out sentence, to mete out sentence punishment that is proportionate to the crime, avoid harsh and or capital punishments, and never punish the innocent relatives to the criminal of the crime. Right? The Prabhupada also claims that the proper function of the ruler is to rule according to Dharma. He should lead a simple life and he should not use his power to enjoy the luxuries of life. Now, Shanti Prabhupada defines Dharma not in terms of ritual or any other precepts, but in terms of what which increases the truth, which is satya, ahimsa, which is non-violence, and asteya, which is non-stealing. Also purity, saucha, and dharma, which is restraint. The book also provides for some have described as a theory of caste, as well as comparative discussion between the rule of truth versus the rule of rituals, declaring truth is far superior from rituals. And this is some of the discussion of Shanti Parva. Now the second is the idea of debate or dialecticism that is manifested in some of the scriptures. And I would like to take this example between two religious persons here, two sages, which is Adi Shankara or Sankaracharya with Mandana Mishra. Now the culture of debate had manifested itself in the Indian civilization since the Vedic period. Dialecticism essentially refers to the art of investigation or discussing the truth of opinions or inquiry into metaphysical contradictions and their solutions. The realization that human existence is confronted with opposing ideas and worldviews, and these differences require to be acknowledged and embraced. As discussed earlier, among the various schools of Indian thought, whether it is either Vedic or non-Vedic traditions of Hinduism, both have produced extraordinary scholars and thinkers in different period of time. Now let me just discuss about this idea of debate here. See, the culture of dialogue that has been aptly captured by the debate between two renowned scholars. One is Adi Shankara and the other one is Mandana Mishra. Adi Shankara, also known as Sankaracharya, is a philosopher who consolidated the teaching of Advaita Vedanta. He is noteworthy in the reinterpretation of the Hindu scriptures especially the Upanishads and Vedanta, had insightful effect on the development of Hinduism. Now, he is also known for unifying and instituting the current thought of Hinduism, whereas Mandana Mishra, the other scholar, a younger scholar, was a well-acclaimed scholar of the Mimamsa philosophy school. Okay, and in the school of thought of a particular ritual is done, and the result has been achieved instantaneously. Let me look at the. All right. Mandana Mishra was an aged. Sorry, the other one. Mandana Mishra was an aged and seasoned scholar, while Adi Shankara was in his 20s at that time. Okay. Right. So there was this debate about certain aspects of Hinduism. But the very interesting about this debate is how the debate was done and how conflict was managed in this debate. Let me just look at this. Alright. So during the debate, for the sake of fairness, Mandana Mishra allowed Sankaracharya to choose his own judge. And Sankaracharya and Sankara chose Mandana's wife, Bharati. The debate continued, right, for about 6 months without stopping and attracted thousands of scholars who came to watch and learn from the debate. Despite being a seasoned and intellectually sharp scholar, Mandana was slowly losing to Shankara. Realizing this, Bharati, Mandana's wife, declared that in order to defeat a man in debate, the opponent should also defeat his wife. This is very unfair. Right? And she's being biased here. So she argued that wives form one half of the husband's body. Alright? Alright. But Shankara agreed to this request. Now, the idea of a husband becoming a sannyasi, because those who lose that debate will become a sannyasi or a celibate monk. Alright? So there goes things over. Right? If he loses to Sankaracharya, okay, it was too traumatic for her. Yeah. At the end, Bharati and Mandana had to admit defeat to Sankara and become Vedantists instead. Okay? So this debate illustrates the healthy competition that existed among scholars and followers of different schools of thought in India. Although these schools may seem to be dissimilar and appear to be heading towards a similar unknown destination, yet they had the open mind and immense courage, okay, to test their faith, to question their beliefs and change their philosophy if reasons demanded the change. Now, these are essential attributes required for a pragmatic conflict resolution thinking: self-questioning, testing new and unknown concepts, experimenting, and also the courage to challenge and change one's own position were widely reflected in the Indian philosophical dialogues over centuries. Alright, I'll go to my last takeaways. Now, having said that, what are the takeaways that we can get from some of these examples that I've alluded here? Basically, that number one, that human being as a species, we are intrinsically conflictual. We are in this constant state of conflict throughout our lives, whether it's interpersonal, personal, with other entities. Right? Conflict is neither good or bad. It's just simply the nature of being a living being, existential being. Therefore, to manage the conflict, the whole idea is actually to make it less conflictual, more peaceful, and sometimes you can't really resolve any conflict, right? You just have to mitigate it. So Indian sages and thinkers have offered certain thoughts about how we should manage our conflicts. I think this is about it. Thank you. It's essentially a work in progress. So I'm still getting a lot of data on how the Indians manage the conflict. This is not to say that the Indians are have been successful in conflict management. If you look at the history, there have been great wars, a lot of violence, like in any other civilization as well. So
So we need to send you to the Middle East.
Right.
So
We'll send Narendra Modi there.
thank you. Thank you, Ravi. It's also interesting in many scriptural stories from different traditions. We have stories of a lot of conflict, and some of the solutions over history seem to be wars. Now, whether these are just descriptions of the sad history as lessons for the future, or statements of war, or statements of nationalism to protect nations. But it's interesting because there are many different stories. So if you go back to show us some examples, why did you include some and not? Can we be selective in terms of how do we organize the dialogue as well? Do we have some examples where the conflict was resolved, some where the conflict persists, some where it's irreconcilable conflicts? I'll let you answer, Ravi.
So your question was why do we select a few and omit the others?
Well, no, it's also what do we learn from these, and how do we organize the hermeneutics of such scriptural interpretations according to the messages we want to learn. So at the times, maybe the peace activists want some sorts of quotation, the soldiers and generals want another sort of quotation to justify their holy war, or the government funding into their,
Yeah, precisely. It's quite interesting, but if you were to look at modern conflicts and ancient or traditional conflicts, it all boils down to national interests, essentially. Now, if we were to look at 2,000 years ago, and more specifically, if you want to look at the Indian tradition, it's all about kingdoms. Right? I mean, that is the system that existed. Humans manage themselves into systems, right? Whether we like a kingdom or a nation state, those are systems. Even if we do not have a nation state at this point of time, humans will come together to create some kind of other systems as well. So we live in a system, and that system that prevailed at that point of time was a system where gave an enormous power to certain individuals, right? And which is here now we call it the state system. Those days were probably the sultanate or the kingdom and whatnot. And it's quite interesting when you look at the idea of the Indian system. The Indian system, to create more legitimacy, validity and legitimacy into those systems. Essentially, we look at here now we have an election, we have a parliament, we have the idea of sovereignty and territorial integrity to give importance to the head of the system. In those days, what they do is they elevate the position of the Maharaja or the king into a god king. So if we were to look at in India especially, and also in Southeast Asia, in archipelagic and also mainland Southeast Asia, a Brahmin priest was sent to all these areas to alleviate the kings into rajas, we call it, to Deva Rajas. Deva Rajas is god kings. The whole idea of this concept is actually to give them more legitimacy to rule, right? Legitimacy to rule. So I think it all boils down to the idea of this. So, and because of this, the concept of blind loyalty or total loyalty or total power comes into play. Now, at the same time, if you were to, some of my readings suggest, if you look at Artha Shastra, you look at Shanti Parva, there are certain, prescription in terms of the relationship, how the relationship between the ruler and the subject should be, number one. Number two, what are the responsibilities within the rulers? And what is the ethical and moral reasoning that one should have in executing those jobs. All right. Like for example, if I think I mentioned in my presentation, if one person is unable to pay tax, then he should not be taxed. If for some reason, the idea of injustice takes a higher level than the idea of meting out punishment, meaning which we refrain from committing injustice as compared to actually meting out punishments in that sense. So there are certain values that appreciate humanity, all right, that has been there. So this project that I'm doing is trying to capture this, and I'm not telling that, Aurangzeb is probably the worst mass murderer of mankind, when he invaded India, in that sense. And India still glorifies it by putting statues about him, so on and so on. So it is an interesting concept that there are different, even when we talk about this, one is the scripture, as you say, hermeneutics explanation, and this one the reality of it. Okay? So it is a mix between both. All right. So essentially my project here looks at what the scripture has to say, and how can we translate this as a kind of a model that we can use for conflict resolution thinking. Right now, conflict resolution is always about interests. All right, you are resolving something because your interests and your needs, and whether you are compatible and strategies involved. Maybe, and it's not so successful in the region that you come from, or someone, right? From Saudi Arabia, or probably it may not be successful in some other conflict regions where people don't see eye to eye on based on many things.
Yeah.
I don't know whether that's explains. Oh, quite confusing.
How sound is
Yeah, that's why. Anyway, I reduced my question to more. But you see, if you look at the question of the theories of conflict, you see, we are living in a globalized world where conflict is explained differently. You look at the works of Morgenthau, the issues of realism, the issues of realism, constructionism, things like that. So the same if you look at the situation in India. India is almost a subcontinent, the long history of Muslims, Hindus, whatever they are. And given the context of conflict now in the global context of India itself, we believe more in the complementarity of knowledge systems to work on conflict solutions. In India, you have different community knowledge systems, which together form India as we know ourselves, so we know today. So how do Muslim ways of conflict transformation, Christianity is there, Hinduism is there, come together there to form what I would call India, lots of conflict, Hindu way of conflict resolution.
Thank you. Interesting. Well, from my travels and speaking to the philosophers in India, it is still a scholarly debate. In reality, conflict resolution has always been looked at from a modern angle, or modern philosophical angle. It's basically based on interest. Okay, let me give you some examples. Let's look at Kashmir. You have to look at India, Pakistan. Yeah, India, Pakistan comes from the same entity. Both of them look alike, although they hate each other. All right. So what happens is actually, how do you reconcile this? In the case of India and Pakistan, this is the idea. You mentioned something about Morgenthau and realism. It is true because states feel that the concept of sovereignty, it's about territory and sovereignty. All right. India sees that Kashmir is an Indian territory because Hari Singh, the ruler of Kashmir, has acceded, signed the instrument of decision, so it's already internal. Pakistan sees it differently, right? It is a occupied territory and so on and so on. So how do you actually manage this? It's very difficult to manage because states see that you cannot negotiate on sovereignty. That's the whole idea of problems in the world, state problem, because they say that as long as sovereignty is there, they cannot negotiate on not even an inch of land. So that's number one. That is a hardening position when it comes to negotiation, and in the negotiation, now you need to balance, you need to give out concessions. Like if you are very stubborn on your own position, then of course there is no negotiation. Right? The ability to look at other people's interests, other parties' interests, and also to look at the end game, which is actually resolution or peace, like what we found in the IRA, in the Good Friday Agreement. Then it goes to that, so that all parties must feel that they are party or they have interest in pursuing peace in that sense. Alright? But in the case of India and Pakistan, it is also national interest. Pakistan doesn't really want to go through that path because of the military. There's other dynamics to it as well. So having said that, now which Indian philosophical tradition you want to apply? I don't think so, unless you unlearn being a nation state. Right? You have to unlearn that realism. You have to unlearn being a modern state and try to incorporate those elements in it. So it's a very tricky thing. Yeah.
Now my question here is the fact that you're bringing the same question as in the situation of Kashmir, where Muslims the other parts, Hindus the other parts, same thing. Look at, for instance, Catholics,
right?
Same thing with issue the Tamils in the south, the northern part of India. Now, in a situation like the Kashmir, you're Muslims, you're Hindus, so what do you call the Indian philosophy?
Well, Indian philosophy says it's non-violence. No? I mean, the whole idea of Satyagraha is actually non-violence. So you should not do anything non-violence. But surprisingly, if you look at the 1940s and 1950s, people like the second president of India, Radhakrishnan, who's also a philosopher, a great philosopher. The Indian philosophers during that period of time, they redefined the idea of nationalism from Indian perspective. They say they kind of legitimized some use of force against the occupiers, right? To tell them that to have, that it is legitimate to use force against your occupiers. I mean, so you find that while the scripture says total non-violence, right? You are supposed to be vegetarian, right? You are supposed to be lead a life where you do not create harm to anything, to human lives. But there is some legitimacy in that sense. So it's a quite tricky thing. I mean, which worldview do you apply to this? Right? So I would argue that because, as you mentioned just now, realism has taught the world how states should behave. Right? If you ask why that people should die because of certain territorial disputes, right, which has gone when people there, people there want to be Pakistanis, but the Indians say no, you cannot be Pakistanis, right? Then again, the question, who has the right to decide? Is it the regime or the people, right? The United Nations Charter says something else. The United Nations Charter says the right of the people for self-determination. But in reality, if you look throughout the world, it is the regimes that decide. Right? So it is so it is a contradiction. That's why I say if you want to apply some of these principles of looking about how to deal with conflicts, then probably we need to unlearn what we have learned for the last 100 years and relearn new things. I'm not sure whether it's possible or not. Yeah, please.
Can I ask a question based on that? I would like to think.
Can you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah. Hi everyone. Sorry I'm late. I had to go to work. My name is Osama. I'm from Saudi Arabia, and I work for the United Nations here in Bangkok. And I've been here for the last 18 years.
And I am a PhD graduate.
And thanks to Daryl, I received my PhD. Thank you very much. And now, with all this information and knowledge, I'm wondering how we can unlearn some of the things that have become so rigid and not subject to change. So this is what I would like to ask about, and I'll bring it to specifics that I'm interested in from a scholastic perspective. So in biology, when we study the organism, we learn that the survival of the organism, an animal, for example, like a human, depends on two mechanisms that oppose one another. And those two mechanisms, conserved evolutionary mechanisms within the cell system, ensure our survival, growth, and proliferation and spreading. And it's when these two mechanisms basically encounter an imbalance where one dominates the other, the organism collapses and cannot reproduce itself. I will not go into details, but just quickly, for those of you who are interested, these mechanisms are known as autophagy, which is responsible for waste disposal in the organism. And the other one is called M2R, which is the mammalian target of tyrosine, which basically senses the amount of nutrients within the body. So those two mechanisms oppose one another. One wants to cleanse everything, one wants to take in and absorb everything. But together, working together, in balance, the organism survives. So now, I'm wondering if there's something like that in Dharma. And the reason I ask that is because the yin-yang concept in Chinese medicine is similar to this mechanism. These two mechanisms, autophagy and the M2R. They envisage basically two forces within the body that control its body. So is there something like this in Dharma that we can then simplify and maybe see if there are insights that can be extracted from Dharma to policy, to basically discuss with our policymakers what is the best way to govern the masses today in this complex world that has become very artificial and has become very, very difficult to govern. And I would add, no existing governance system today, not even the best democracies in the world, actually are successful. No longer. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Osama. The last I met you was Mr. Osama.
Evolution.
Evolution.
Evolutionary changes.
Okay. Right, very interesting concept about balance. From my reading of Dharma essentially talks about ethical reasoning and ethical duties. So ethics is actually quite widely defined by Hinduism. But there's also contradiction of the Dharma. In fact, some of the Nastika school, which is actually that actually did not agree on certain ethical principles or certain conducts within the Astika schools, right? And that has brought about the other faith system like Buddhism and Jainism, pretty much these two, Buddhism and Jainism, which is a reaction to Hinduism. Or that was my slide. Never mind. Okay. My battery pumped off. Right. So that is one aspect. But having said that, the Dharma prescribes what we call a moral reasoning to how we should live with ourselves, or how do we understand our own existence, number one. How do we need to, our responsibility and the nature that we need to work with or exist together with nature and with other sentient beings, number two. And also about living in a society, right? The whole idea of the roles and responsibility between our subject and the ruler, like for example, a family. It's all prescribed, in all the what do you call it, ethics of Dharma. So when for a Hindu, when they say it's Dharma, it means that is my given duty. That is what I'm here to do. All right, that's my Dharma. All right. So that's a concept.
Like the calling?
Right, that's a calling. Yeah. Right. That is the purpose of life for me. Right. So having said that, now how can we relate that into current day thinking about responsibility and balance? I think there is a misbalance. I'm actually a political scientist. So the kind of a misbalance, because right now when you look at it, we talk about utility, that we spoke about earlier this morning. We talk about how it benefits individuals. And if you look at the state system, like for example, when we talk about security and goodness, it's all for an organization. We are working for an organization. The state is more supreme than you. But if you were to look at the last 20 years, there have been a greater voice, right, if I could relate this Dharma, to the idea of humanity, which is actually the concept of human security. In 1994, Darrell may know very well, there was this document by UNDP, right, and it talks about the idea of human security. But to me, that is, the idea of human security, the debate started when we had the 48th Declaration of Human Rights. The spirit of that has been there, which has been slowly worked on, and it came out in a kind of a document in 1994. Although it is quite a contested document, understood by the states. But the whole idea is to bring the debate of international relations to the protection of humanity. That means when you talk about security or international relations, for whom? It's for the human beings. State is one of the components to ensure the security of the human beings, right? And its environment, and its economy, and its body, and all towards like that. So there is a movement, nonetheless. But it will take a long time, I think, right? It will take a long time, because the whole idea of international relations has been ingrained in the idea of statehood. So I think it will, even in India for that matter, even Narendra Modi talks about, using the Hindutva. He came up, this is a new thing about this, the BJP government. This Hindutva. Hindutva is actually a concept, looking at Indian scriptures, humanitic explanation about this. But there's also resistance. The Muslims and Christians are resisting, right? He declared Yoga Day as an instrument of peace. A lot of people are resisting as well. So I think whenever there is a religious-based idea or postulation, there will be some resistance. A lot of, in the case of India, a lot of resistance as well. So, but I think there's a movement is there. When you say about balance and imbalance, right? Internationally, I think the idea of securitizing the humans, right, or putting a human being and his environment in the center of the security debate has really started in that sense. The last 20 years. Well, it has not grown to that level yet, but still, I think it's on the. Yes, our rich professor. He's a rich professor. Kaya in Malay is rich.
Yeah, but I mean, personally, the problem I'm having is, I agree with the way you are saying, but you see, if you look at from the states, because you go, because you say you are political, you are international relations, you go from the states, relations, things like that. But the issue here is, if you look at the question of the balance of power, is the states in international relations, because I look at the states as the actors in international relations. And that question of realism is the question that comes, the question of conflict between states. That's why realism, like urban power. Now, if you look at the Hindu philosophy, I will generalize the Indian philosophy, and I come to that one, is if you look at the theory of international relations, it's categorized as a kind of an idealism. Because in the real sense, all these things is some of us talk about virtue, compassion, whatever. In international relations, when we look at the power relations, we categorize it as idealism because it does not happen in the real sense. And that's why you have people like Marxism, a theory like Marxism, You've got Marxism now, structuralist, structural modern, all these theories, because they look at those things that in the real sense it doesn't happen. Because there are class issues. India, your problem of what? Case, and all these, the question of wars, conflict over resources. It's a package of so many things, whereby you can't categorize that all the people in India, however percentage the people might be, that you can call that the Indian philosophy of conflict resolution. And he comes also with what we also categorize. I also, when I talk of Ubuntu, it's idealistic, because those class issues, caste issues, and then with the Muslims, with the Hindus, with the Catholics, because in the same country. So all those things need to be taken into consideration to come up with a theory which I would comfortably call Indian philosophy. Otherwise, if I lived in India and sit here, on the question that they were producing.
Well, it's not existing. We are looking at, like in Islam, we have this notion about political Islam. Political Islam is, it's defined by the Caliph system, perhaps, or the Shura system, or having an Islamic law in that sense, more prescribed Islamic law. And so they have a more prescriptive idea of what state is. Alright, that's a Muslim state. This is a good question. I asked a friend of mine, Professor Manisandra from Madras University. I said, do we have like that a Hindu government? You say that if it is a Hindu state, alright, what does it prescribe to? We don't have. What we have is explanation about responsibility. So Dharma talks about this. It talks about responsibility and how we should live. It's something like the Buddhism or the Confucianism as well, right? So it is not prescriptive in that nature. So it doesn't tell you that must be a legal system in place, but it tells you overall what are the responsibility of the state, of the ruler. And they may have not defined state as a nation state as we define now. We are talking about these are 3,000 years of scriptures, right? So this is, but there has been, some kind of a structure or an administrative system at that point of time with clear demarcation of responsibilities and duties. And this Dharma talks about that. Alright, so it looks at more of a holistic manner. Look at virtues, look at also values. Right? I told you about the idea of human rights, which is reflected. But it does not prescribe in detail the procedures that it should undergo. In certain kingdoms, maybe that has been written. The only document that prescribed this was Artha Shastra, which talks about art of war. It's your responsibility in conflict. It's similar to our just war doctrine, right, which has a Christian St. Augustine lineage that talks about how do you manage, what are your responsibility before, during, and after, which was the basis for much of the UN document on covenant on torture and war. So I think the reason I'm telling you, it's more of a philosophical idea. Okay. All right. It's not being practiced now. I mean, I hope, I'm still wondering to what extent Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister of India, will be able to execute his Hindutva movement. Hindutva is actually the ways of the Hinduism. But there's a lot of resistance, even among Muslims. They are the Congress party. They are saying, no, you should not go towards that, because they are circular state. But having said that, but as a political, as a philosophical debate or explanation, the systems are there, but it is not prescriptive system, as I can understand it.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Ravi.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
Okay, good.
Tayabi, please.
I thought I'm done for the day.
I
Tayabi.
had a question in the third page of your presentation.
Alright, so sorry. No bad.
I think it was, is human being a conflictual creature? Something like that?
Oh yeah,
What's your answer?
well, we are, I think. We are. Human
Can I
beings are, in
ask-
nature, they're conflictual. Alright?
Could you please, I would like to...
Can you use the mic,
know
please?
The others, I would like to know the others' answer to first please.
So,
What is the question
Whether-
again?
are human
Could you
beings...
please ask your question again?
Okay, I mean, in one of my slides, I said, so I could ask whether human nature is it conflictual? Is human nature conflictual?
So are human beings inherently conflictual in genes or ethos? I think we have a mixture of conflict resolution for the survival of a group and rivalry. We can see in some animals this idea of conflicts, but usually the outcome of the conflict may not be the fight to the death. The outlet of conflict may even not require a conflict once the power structure is clear. The hierarchy is established. So we are hierarchical in our social structure. Unlike some other animals, we kill. But some other animals also kill. But the idea of conflict and power struggles, I think, goes back through many different species, inside the species. So inherently, we are used to having conflict and creating structures of power. Territorial, we have territory, which we try and claim and protect. So I think the answer is we are inherently in that sense, but the question is, are we inherently also peacemakers because of a need for that in survival? We probably have both. But I don't think we are inherently destructive, because if we were, there would be no survival mechanism in the end. Yeah? You would defeat your species if you always destroy. So ask the Neanderthals and they might have a different answer about us.
I think there's a concept called rivalry in interdependency. You are interdependent, like in a family structure, right? We are interdependent in that sense, or in an organization structure. But we still accommodate some level of rivalry, just for us to reconcile differences and also interests. Right? Whenever there's a conflict of interest, then there will be some level of friction. But it's all done within the whole gamut of interdependency. That means like,
And how do you think about it?
Me?
First of all, nice to meet you. I
Thank you.
heard your voice in Skype sessions, and I learned from your comments always. So it's great.
Thank you. Same here. It's good to see the person in face to face. Okay, so I'll give you a little bit of context to tell you why my answer is like this. When I was in college in the States, I wrote a paper on the pro-life and pro-choice movement. And I was investigating the two positions and why there was conflict between the two sides. And to make a long story short, I concluded that the values and the needs of the two groups of women were different. So you had pro-choicers who wanted the woman to have the ultimate decision on her body, regardless of economic, social, moral, doesn't matter. I'm in charge of my body, I decide whether I'm going to keep the baby or not. So that was the pro-choice value. The other side conceded to that notion of choice. However, they preferred to give life a higher value to choice. So even if the pregnancy was unplanned and unwanted, the result of the pregnancy has to be protected, cared for, and let live, basically. So that was a value, yeah? That guided everything else that they talked about, they discussed all of their rights, their pamphlets. These values were operating behind these two positions. And I concluded that wherever the values are different, the conflict will continue. Yeah, and this is a group of women that I studied. This is back in the late 80s, and there were about 5,000 of them from both sides. And they're all activists. So not just the general public. These are the activists themselves, whose philosophical opinions tend to be very pure, almost extremist. and that was my conclusion. So wherever there's conflicting values, the conflict continues. So that's my answer to you. If our values, on the other hand, kind of like I was leading with my question to Ravi here, if we can find values from Dharma that are similar to the yin and yang, similar to what we find in our biology, maybe in Islam, maybe we can then end the conflict. Thank you.
Thank you.
Other comments? Balon?
Are humans by nature? Well, if you want to be Aristotelian and Platonic about it, man by nature is a being of conflict. Considering the conflict within himself, conflict between reason, spirit, and the appetite, for example, which are the two parts of the soul in the dualistic philosophy of the Greeks. That the appetite's always the most uncontrollable part of the soul. That's where desires and urges are. That's where our tendency to be undisciplined are. And of course the spirit and the reason. But it does not end with the idea that we are conflict beings by nature. They also give us an idea that but there is a power within man that allows us to control that conflict tendency. And Aristotle or Plato will say, you have to let the reason control the lower parts. Now, if we try to discover common grounds where we can use probably to resolve conflict, I don't know. It's quite a difficult task. I cannot say love. We have different conceptions of love, by the way. And if we follow bioethics of love, of Darryl, who knows? So we develop a common concept of love. There are, like the Papua New Guineans, it's Papua New Guineans, that's a concept of love in their language. You know. They don't have a word for it, but they know how to express it. I think it's somewhat there. I've read of that before. So, among religions, that's more complicated. We know for a fact that many of the great troubles in the world are religious by nature. Religious by nature. Politics, it's problematic, especially when politics is mixed with some state-sponsored values that are quite difficult to debunk. It's really difficult to find commonality. If love, well, probably Darryl can expound on that and influence others to believe that love can be a common ground for us in resolving conflict. But my answer would be, I think it's within the nature of man to really believe in a world of conflict, even within ourselves. But we should not also deny the truth that within us we can also control it. And, if reason takes over. We may agree to disagree, but at least we agree to disagree.
Maya and Hassan?
I think from a biological background. I think you used a nice example about the body always trying to ensure a state of balance. It's always wanting to be regulate itself, trying to stay in the status of homeostasis. And so you think inherently the body would want, if you look at the body as a system, us as a human being, the system of this human being, it always wants to be in a sense of balance. And even when something needs to be destroyed in our body for natural purposes, it doesn't seem to want to deny that. It says, okay, so if when our body is being created, the skin cells, the cells between here needs to die, so in order for us to have fingers, it dies naturally. It seems to be accepting. So I would like to think inherently we are not human beings. We are not inherently conflicted. We were not born wanting to be in conflict. However, our situations and environments now, when we enter in the world, we find ourselves in that situation of having to deal and manage with conflict. And therefore we have, within ourselves as societies, these moral philosophies to guide us to manage that conflict, to manage that situation. I think in the last conference in Nepal, I was talking about the universality of moral philosophies. The Prof had spoken about Ubuntu. Trying to find similarities across the different knowledge systems, moral philosophies in the world. I think in achieving that, perhaps. So yeah, I think it's more that way.
Hassan, yep.
Yeah, you see, it depends on the way you understand by conflict. Conflict is not always negative. Conflict can also be functional. Because, you see, when people hear the word conflict, they don't always think in terms of violence, in terms of fighting, whatever. But if you look at even what in the Marxism we call dialectical materialism, it is through conflict that society moves forward. Whether you take an organic analogy, as you are saying, using your body, what comes out, what comes in. Conflict is inherently part of our life as a human being. It is what makes us what? Grow and evolve. In that sense, that function, that conflict is not always negative. It can also be functional. At the same time, conflict can be, as students of political science, conflict depends on how you look at it in class terms. Because if you look at the history of Marxism, Marx talks that before prehistory, before the coming of the slave model production, society lived in a communal way, sharing resources. Okay? And conflict in that existed as being part of human nature, but it was not conflictual because people shared resources. But since private property came, even read the works of Engels and the origin of the family, he said the family as you understand it today originated with the coming of private property. When the patriarchal society came into being and people started owning other people like chattel, like the property. So the conflict, the way we understand, is violence, is exploitative, came with a particular moment in time in history. It did not always exist. But at the same time, we, as you said yourself, Dr. Osama, whatever, that in a modern conflict, as modern society as we live today, global society with global issues of climate change, HIV, and violence based on religion and different perspectives, we must believe in a complementarity of knowledge system, complementarity of system, whereby, as you said rightly, let different persuasions, ideologies come together, find a common way of solving a particular problem. For instance, in the case of India, which is the topic we are having now, is to see how do the Hindus, as the dominant group in India, those the Muslims, the Buddhists, whatever, come together, look at how do they solve the problems of the Kashmir and on Pakistan and India, how do they solve the problem of Tamils in the south and not India. In other words, massive complementarity of ideology, knowledge system to solve a common problem. Yeah, but conflict can also be functional, can also be positive, because it's part of our problem as humans and the societies.
Wow.
Thank you.
Can
Thank you.
we ask a question from this girl too?
Okay,
if possible?
please stay here with Tayabi. We have a question for you.
Daddy,
You can ask.
could you please ask your question from your child?
Is conflict inherent?
You probably wouldn't know what's conflict. Do you know what's conflict? Conflict when people will disagree.
Get stress.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
Something
it is a
else.
stress response. Very smart.
Yeah, when you get stressed, sometimes you fight with people, right?
Yeah, like
So do you think it's natural to fight? Do you think it's natural to fight with, to disagree with people? Is it natural? When you get angry, is it something natural? No, it's not.
really? What's natural?
Not natural.
What's natural?
Natural means it's okay.
Is it normal?
Is it normal? It's normal, huh? Right.
Especially usually in Russia. Yeah, of course it's normal.
Thank you. I have last question from Andrew for you, Ravi.
All right.
It's a religious question and Andrew's getting more and more religious with the day.
Hi, Andrew.
What's the cost of embracing and applying Dharma? If we choose not to follow a path of transcendence, can we still embrace it? And what about jhanas and other paths of eternal duality, like those who yield Dharma like a weapon?
Right.
Okay. Thank you, Andrew.
That's true.
Good question.
Okay. Can you please sit? So can you repeat that question again?
The first one, what's the cost of embracing and applying Dharma? If we choose not to follow the path of transcendence, can we still embrace it? Okay. So what's your comment?
Okay. Dharma is, according to the scriptures, it is a way of life or a way of reasoning life from an ethical perspective. So there is a ethical dimension when it comes to looking at Dharma. So Dharma can be said to be a set of duties. Of course, when you look at from a religious perspective, we use the word righteous duties. It looks at responsibility that you have with other sentient beings, with nature, with the Creator. It also talks about the purpose of life, why you are here for on earth. So it talks about Dharma, essentially it talks about the reason you are being here and what are you supposed to do. I mean that's the whole idea of Dharma. So what is the cost of embracing and applying Dharma? So if you are a Hindu, when you have a choice whether to embrace it or not to embrace it, it's pretty much your choice, right? And some of us, by being moral beings, we also embracing much part of it actually. All right. I mean there is no set of principles which is only peculiar to a particular value system. Dharma is also reflected in other major religions in the world, and also other ancient traditions, like for example Confucianism and whatnot. So there is we cannot claim that certain elements of Dharma to be Hindu specific in that sense. All right, so that's the point number one. So, so the cost of applying or not applying Dharma is pretty much your own decision. All right, whether the second one, whether we want to go through the idea of transcendental, meaning which you are now looking at using Dharma to elevate yourself, because Hinduism talks about moving upwards in the level of consciousness. All right, Hinduism prescribes that in order for you to move upwards towards different level of realization, then you need to practice certain values or certain actions that will slowly elevate you. I mean, there are different kinds of bhakti yoga, karma yoga, law of actions and things like that, whichever path that you follow. So if you choose to go on that path, well and good. But if you do not choose, it's also up to you. So there is no compulsion here, when you talk about Dharma. But the whole idea from it's not really, Hinduism is actually a Western conception, it's more of Sanatana Dharma. Sanatana Dharma is actually the concept of Hinduism. If you look at the Sanatana Dharma perspective, it essentially looks at the concept of righteousness. Alright? So whether you choose that path or you choose 20% or 50% or 100% is solely dependent upon you. There is no compulsion in that sense. So what is the negative thing that you do not apply? I don't think that question arises. It is the idea of whether you want to follow a particular path or you want to follow partially a particular path or you do not want to follow a particular path. I think that kind of freedom exists in Hinduism. That's my answer.
Thank you very much, Ravi. So the conclusion on Dharma. We'll come back to